by the mix of topics and expertise that you all collectively bring. And Anne was telling me over lunch a bit more about the background to this centre and its ethos and what you'll all be doing to sort of fulfil the vision, and it sounds incredibly exciting. And so I'm very keen to sort of maintain links after today, because a lot of the topics that you've said that you're interested in and been involved in are very much all things that I've had experience of being involved in from a government perspective and commissioning research. So just to tie that in a bit with where I've come from and what I do day to day, my background is in sociology and social policy. So I've dabbled in university research in the past, but the vast majority of my experience is working as a policy researcher in central government. And I'm a member of what's called the Government Social Research Profession. GSR is its abbreviation. And it's one of 4 analytical professions in government. So we have economists, statisticians, operational researchers and social researchers, and together we support policymakers to identify and access and use the sorts of evidence that is going to be useful for them to deliver their policy goals. So that in a nutshell is what I do. And I've had experience of working in 5 government departments, starting off with what is now DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, working in that department on families, on mental health issues as an issue to gaining and staying in employment. I've worked in the Treasury for a bit on mental health policy, Cabinet Office, the Food Standards Agency, and now since 2010 I've been in the Department of Health, now Department of Health and Social Care. Not that the department wasn't involved in social care before, but it's felt the need to sell that in its name. The role I've currently got, I've had for a couple of years now, and I work with Louise Wood and Chris Whitty in what's known as the Science, Research and Evidence Directorate. And my particular function is to work on policy research, which is all now under the umbrella of the NIHR, but it's a unique NIHR research programme that is specifically aimed at the department's ministers, policymakers, and also what we call our arm's length bodies, so Public Health England, NHS England, we support that. And I head up a section that is responsible for policy research on health improvement, so obesity policy, older people, children and families. There's a whole panoply of things that fall under the umbrella of health improvement research. So I think the key thing to say is that in my day-to-day work, I am at the interface of policy and academia. All of the research that the department commissions is predominantly through academic-led institutions who may sort of bring in other types of researchers as well. So just picking up on the point that you made, Anne, is that each government department is actually quite different in the way in which it generates evidence for policy and the way in which it works with academics. And I'll come back to say a little bit more about that in the few slides on, so to speak. So that's a bit about me, and you've helpfully given a flavour of why you're here and what you're hoping we might get into today. And I am struck by how you will all have, it sounds like some of you have had experience of working with policymakers. I mean, I've got experience of working with national policymakers, but somebody's mentioned local. Ray, you've obviously know a little bit more about the space I inhabit, but I'm hoping that we can pool our experience and sort of learn from each other, because this is a sort of critical area, and we keep needing to come back and revisit how we can strengthen the links between policymaking and academia. So, Anne, on my left, if you can bring up the first slide. Just that quote there, policymaking is a core task for government, but to make policy well, government needs to be open to external ideas, including from academics. So this quote comes from a fairly recent report from the Institute of Government, which was published last June. And it's the latest in a range of reports that I can remember from my time working in government about this whole space of academia working with policy making, and saying, so I think everyone is agreed that it's important, but we keep needing to revisit it because there's always room for improvement and things that we can learn from as to what is going well at the moment. So I think the key message that I want to get across today, and be interested to know if you sort of pick this up yourselves from an academic environment, is that there's very much an ethos that working together is great for impact in policy making, but also impactful research. And I know that with the last REF, that impact is one of those areas that has actually been boosted in importance, that kind of reflects this. So together we can support our own worlds, so to speak. So the next slide is just to give a flavour of what I'm hoping that we will cover today, and there are three main aspects. So one is to get into a little bit about what do we mean when we say policymakers, and what their world is like, what sort of what's the day-to-day life of a policymaker like. Then the second one, which you may well have some thoughts on already, are the challenges and facilitators of engaging with policy. And then finally, just to get into a bit of some of the good examples that already exist, and any thoughts you've got, any experience you've got of those, and any other ideas that you might have. Yeah, synthesis is something which is I'm wanting to end on, because there's a niche there which I think is going to grow in importance. So that will be a final aspect. So the first bit then is around policymakers and their working environment. And I'm just wondering, just for a couple of minutes, if you wouldn't mind just speaking with your neighbour, just to compare notes on any experience you've got with policymakers, and if you haven't, just your understanding of who you think we mean when we're talking about policymakers, and just thoughts you've got on what it's like to work in a policy type role, how it might differ from working in a university. So just a couple of minutes, and then we'll just gather your thoughts. Right, there was lots of chat there, so I'm really intrigued to just a few thoughts on who are policymakers, who's prepared to be brave and say what they had any direct experience of a policymaker, and where they were. Were they in a big Whitehall department, or in a local council, perhaps, or something else entirely?
I don't know whether they would class themselves as policymakers, but we've worked closely with directors of public health in terms of identifying an evidence gap and then having them as partners in the piece of research that we developed to try and address that evidence gap.
Now they're a type of policymakers. They're setting the agenda for their local sort of health and wellbeing boards, for example. And anyone got another example?
We've done that. On a local level, we've met with commissioners within health to talk about mental health services and stuff.
So that'd be the clinical commissioning groups.
So I guess I don't know when you like to say whether they would come into policy, but I guess it's more service work.
Certainly that's another group that I think falls under the umbrella of policy maker.
Well, we didn't actually discuss it. I was wondering about politicians because I've dealt with policymakers in that Whitehall sense a lot across different departments, but then they get very enthusiastic about the research. They go to their political masters or mistresses, and then they come back and basically say, "Oh no, they're not going to do that. It's it's too expensive, or it's political dynamite. They're not going to touch it, or they just kick it into the long grass." So I wondered whether the politicians themselves regard themselves as policy makers or just receivers of policy, which they then decide which ones should be put
Interesting.
forward. I don't know what you think.
Notion. I would probably say that they don't see themselves as policy makers, but setting the direction for policy makers, for their civil servants.
I'm going to interrupt on behalf of the online people. We can come back to you, Anne. I just want them to think we're ignoring them. Zayna says California lobbying groups are something she's going to be looking into. Sorry, yes.
No, good point, And moving on to the sort of context in which they work, did you have any thoughts about how the world of a policymaker might differ from working? What was that?
Just our time scales. I mean, they're commissioning on a 12-month cycle, and we go away and say, "Come back in 10 years, and we'll tell you whether it works."
We'll tell you it won't. We'll come back to that.
And I think from in academia, we're particularly in health, encouraged to think about implementation when we're developing programs from the outset. So there's I can understand why we're encouraged to think about this, but what we don't think about is what to do if the program doesn't work, and that has just as many implications as if it does. But it's trying to get the learning. It's much easier to get the learning from things that do work than from things that haven't been proven to be effective into policy.
That's a really good point. And from my experience, when worked on experimental research, and it's trying to get across that the policy hasn't worked, but the evaluation has, and now you've learned about something not to throw any more money at. It's a difficult message, but it's valuable and powerful in its own right. And anything else?
You just building on that, because I think there's a lot of research into specific programs, interventions in terms of do they work, don't they work, which is what we do in terms of research. And then you've got within communities, they're running programs that don't necessarily have evidence of effectiveness in the gold standard way that we work to, RCTs, but they're being delivered. But there's no research into actually what's the most effective way of joining them all up. So you're hitting probably 5-6 key issues rather than have lots of different programs all working independently, focusing on specific one thing like obesity or something else, where actually where's the research to actually look at how all the services can work together to have a much bigger impact on creating community empowerment and improving mental health, which is what they're trying to do with where I'm working in Cranbrook. But I mean, it's almost as if haven't we been here before? And why are we now only just talking about this coming up again, when really we know that this is probably a major issue and has been for a long time? So it's just frustrating.
But you hit another interesting point, which is about how these issues come around again. So and about how to be sort of savvy and wise to that.
So can I just check in? Rebecca, Amy, do you have anything you'd like to put in at this point?
I'm quite interested in the role of charity sector in this as well, because in pregnancy and infant loss, a lot of the big charities like SANS end up really heavily influencing things like bereavement care in the NHS, because they do their own research, they present it to government quite directly or to MPs quite directly, and then it gets adopted because the government or the civil service doesn't want to go through its own processes of research. So it's a sort of way of bypassing some of the civil service, I think. I mean, certainly the SANS bereavement care pathway that's used in a lot of hospitals has been developed by them and implemented by government sort of as it is, which I think is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, and I think you've because the main point I wanted to get across, which you've nicely illustrated from the examples you've given, is that policymakers, they're not a homogenous group. They're working at the national, the local level, and also in different sectors as well. And the voluntary and third sector organisation have quite a different way of engaging with policymakers when we're talking about politicians, and they are a strong voice that competes with academic evidence. So it was something that I was going to come on to a bit later, but I think, thank you very much for articulating that now. That's a useful point.
I think the others are all okay. Yeah.
Okay, so Anne, if you could bring up the next slide, which I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, go on to the next one. Whether you're familiar with this sort of diagram. In essence, it's a diagram that shows the policy-making cycle. If you Google policy-making cycle, all sorts of permutations of this will appear. This is the official one that comes from Her Majesty's Treasury, and it's called the Rome F cycle. And as you'll be able to see for yourselves, each of those letters stands for a different component that goes into policy making. There is meant to be a logic, and that you start at the top thinking about what is the purpose of a policy, what are we trying to get, all the way around to implementing it, evaluating it, and then feeding it back into the policy cycle. So that is the sort of neat way in which things are meant to happen. It doesn't always work out quite like that. A point I was going to make later is actually policy making is a very messy business, but that's an advantage for evidence in a way. So I think the point here with this policy making cycle is that because there are different elements, you've got people involved who have different strengths. So you have people who work as sort of policy strategists. So they're the people thinking of all the big ideas, where at a national level, what should politicians be in? They've got their big manifestos. Well, what policies will support that? So you've got the big thinkers. Then you've got policymakers who get more into the nitty-gritty of turning the big ideas into some specific, tangible policy options. You'll then have policymakers who try and deliver that, make it work on the ground, so they'll get more into the operational side of policy. And then there'll be those who want to know, once it has been delivered, how is it actually working? Is it working as was envisaged? So they'll get more into the monitoring and evaluation side. So policymakers will have all of those skills, and will probably get involved at various junctures in their policy career in different aspects of that. But it was just to illustrate really that policy making involves different things, and you get different types of people involved in it. And I think so, a couple of you have mentioned about the speed, that's a big differential between the academic environment and the policymakers' environment. As you all know, we've got with this government, well, since 2010, we've got 5-year general elections. So at most, a policymaker is working to a 4/5-year timetable. But I say at most, you've seen the numbers of comings and goings that we get with ministers. And I think one of the big surprises to me when I started working in government is that when a minister of the same sort of political spectrum is replaced by another one of the same, when they move to another department, the one that's coming in new doesn't necessarily pick up exactly where the previous one left off, because they've got their own agenda. So you could find a slight change, or it could be quite a fundamental change, and you're back to the drawing board again. So actually, 5 is is more like a two-year cycle that they might be looking to. So you know how long it takes.
Stakeholder engagement.
So timetables and timing is something that is crucial, and you just have to be aware of that. But there are some tricks to it. The other thing is that each department has, say, 4 or 5 ministers, but each minister has a huge portfolio of responsibility. How they juggle the different areas, going from one thing to the next in the course of the day. So similarly, the policymakers supporting them underneath are dealing with lots of different topics, changing all the time. So it's a very pressured environment. I'm sure that's not news to you, but it's worth reinforcing that that their world is quite frenetic and subject to a lot of change at the 11th hour. So if you could put up the next slide, Anne. I said at the beginning that I'm from the government social research profession, and there are other analytical professions, but the whole of the civil service is actually made up of numerous professions. You have lawyers, you have HR professionals, and you have people working in the communications profession, and policy making is a profession in its own right. So every profession in government we have a core set of competencies that we all have to follow, but each profession has its own, and policy making is not alone. So what this diagram is showing you is the 3 dimensions of the policy profession, what they have to do, and you'll see evidence is one of those. So it is core to the business of policymakers, along with understanding how to deliver policy and how to manage the political context in which policy is produced. So a policymaker has got to sort of juggle and balance those 3 aspects as part of their job. So I think the main thing I want to say here is that your business of generating new research or secondary analysis is the business of policymakers. They are held to account for making sure they need to be able to demonstrate that for every policy area they're responsible for, they understand the evidence that lies behind it. They need to know what the gaps are. They need to know what to prioritise in terms of filling gaps. And they need to work very closely with the likes of my profession and the other analytical professions to make sure that government is spending public money wisely on getting newer evidence commissioned that will support the business of policy making. So it may not from the outside seem as if policymakers know much about evidence. I think it's fair to say that the culture, the environment has been changing quite a lot in the last 10 years, and policy has been professionalised as a profession in its own right. And Chris Wormold, who is the top-notch civil servant in the Department of Health and Social Care now, he is the overall head of the policy profession. He is an economist by background, so he is a very strong ally of evidence, and he's really got behind professionalising the evidence part of the policymaker's job. So, if Anne could put up the next slide, here's just a couple of, I hope it's come out all right on this slide. Here's some quotes that are in that report that I mentioned earlier. Now, the one on the right, in the grey text box, this comes from the Sir Nick Macpherson, who was the permanent secretary in the Treasury. He moved on a few years ago. But he says, as you can read for yourselves, but I am sometimes a little frustrated that we don't make better use of academics. We clearly have an immense pool of academic talent on our doorstep. And while there are many excellent examples of collaboration, it often feels like we could be doing more. And the box in the middle at the bottom says about how senior officials in Whitehall do care about improving their links with academia and making sure that policy making is formed by the latest thinking and the best expertise. But it's recognising that there are lots of obstacles to doing that we've got to continue to work on to make a better chance of doing this better. So what I'd like, I'm sure you have got thoughts on what are the barriers and what might be the enablers, and what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, maybe in some, not in pairs, but perhaps in little groups, if possible, maybe 3s or 4s, is to work together for about, I don't know, 7 minutes or so, just to pool your thoughts on what are the critical obstacles to university academics being able to work with policymakers, and what, from your experience or any great ideas you've got from what I've been saying, as to how, how can we start to make this better.
So Amy and Rebecca.
So in a minute, I've got a slide with a few of the common things that comes up when you speak to people, and that comes up in some of these reports that I mentioned. So we can play a bit of bingo in a minute, but I'd be interested to see what came up in your discussions. And Anne, should we go to the phones?
Yeah, let's go to the people, to the online people first for a change.
All right. So can you just give us a few thoughts on what came up in your discussions on barriers and any wheezes on enablers? Is anybody happy to speak for the group? There's no right or wrong answers, so don't be frightened.
We just don't know who to talk first, I suppose. We talked about the difficulties of being invited to participate in, and how you need to sort of be in the right place at the right time to be one of the people who actually gets involved in the process or gets invited to sit on a panel or present a paper or produce your evidence in some way. That's one of the difficulties. We talked about the enormous sort of breadth of focus that some of the policy making tasks that people are given involve, and how difficult that was to kind of deal with.
What do you mean by that?
Well, maybe Amy can explain that better, because that was really
so
one of
this
the things
was-
she was talking about her experience.
Oh, you made it. Just as I got down.
Last year, where I know somebody was running a pregnancy review for the Department of Health and Social Care, and she was given sort of 1 day a week for a few months to talk about whether there should be pre-24-week birth registration. So it's kind of challenging the abortion laws and viability and loads of other stuff. And then it got widened into reviewing the whole of pregnancy loss for the
Right, okay.
1 day a week for about 4 months, and then it got extended a bit, and it just seemed like such a huge philosophical and contentious issue. And I fed into this a little bit, but it was really tricky to think that it just felt like the minister had gone, oh, let's review it, you go and do that, and not really giving them the resources and the ability to do it effectively. So I'm interested to see what they come up with. They're reporting next month, and I think it's going to be really tricky for them.
Okay. Did you have any thoughts on enablers or things that you think might work, or know a good examples to overcome some of these issues? Don't worry if you haven't. It's very easy to focus on what's difficult.
We did have a bit of a conversation about advocacy officers in charities and things like that, and how that is part of their job. I mean, that is their job, is to work with policy makers all the time. So charities have a function for that, whereas academics don't. And maybe, you know, that kind of networking and constant contact is definitely an enabler.
Interesting. Well, thank you. Now, others may have come up with similar thoughts, but I'd be interested, this group here, have you got any other topics that came up from your conversation?
Well, some of the enablers, I was saying that sometimes you need to invite policymakers to come to you. You know, whether they come or not, it gives them an awareness of the research that you're doing. You need to write on 2 levels, you know, one for academics, so you get your F articles, and another in a 2-page maximum briefing paper with nice bullet points, so somebody busy can just pick out what they're looking for. Possibly using them on an advisory group, policymakers, whether they come or not. Again, they see the progress of a project, and Impact Accelerator Awards can enable you to pick up and run with policy implications later on, perhaps. They were some of the enablers that we were talking about, and you had some of them.
Well, or just, I mean, you know, for us, making our research to make a difference is the ultimate aim of us doing research. So actually, I think there's a huge desire to engage with policymakers and to see our research have a wider effect. And Branwen made a really good point about actually maybe involve us in the beginning in helping set the questions, so that we're not just servicing with the evidence, but we actually can determine the nature of the problem with the policymakers.
Thank you for that. Over here, have you got any other thoughts, or even if you just want to echo things that others have said? If you haven't got anything additional.
Yeah, I'm sort of so it's quite a personal question, I suppose, and it's slightly gloomy. So I was kind of almost thinking about the flip side to that enthusiasm to engage with policymakers, and I wondered how you dealt with the kind of obverse of that, which is, I suppose, what I'd kind of describe as academic skepticism and kind of despair about some aspects of policy. So, for example, like I work in loneliness, I'm interested in loneliness, and it's sort of, there may be people who've had a lot more success in influencing policy, for example, in different kind of health sectors, but it's not necessarily, loneliness isn't necessarily one of them, I don't think. So it's kind of difficult to understand. It's almost, to me, the kind of locus of what's going wrong isn't between kind of academics and policymakers. It's between policymakers and actually kind of getting good ideas into practice, in the sense that, sorry, I'm not being very articulate. I think I...
No, carry on.
It's, so for example, I mean, we had quite a recent kind of loneliness strategy out from the government, which said that it would build concerns about loneliness into policy, all future policy across departments. So for a start, I kind of don't really know what that would look like. But also my concern would be that that really hasn't been done up to this point. And so it's not so much that you, although I have vast amounts of interesting knowledge and research, obviously, it's not so much that kind of policymakers need to listen to me. It's that, I mean, this stuff's been kind of washing around for absolutely ages.
Yes.
I mean, it was really interesting to hear you talk about Cranbrook, because I'm really interested in Cranbrook. And some of the stuff about kind of dealing with all of those challenges of new towns, and what happens when you suddenly bring lots of people into contact without all of those kinship networks, all of those things. I mean, those things have been being discussed in serious depth since the 1930s. And sometimes it feels like we're rehashing all of these things, because there's all of this kind of, there's lots amounts of research and ideas and good ideas, but somewhere it's not filtering through into actual kind of political will, I suppose. And I kind of, for me, the disconnect is okay, here's, because I would really like to make a difference with the things I think about all the time. So if I engage with policymakers, I mean, at what point do my ideas then just hit a brick wall and sort of shrivel up and die? Because in some ways, very clearly, that's what's happened, because you don't see the effects of these things at all. I mean, this is kind of, it can be quite galling in some ways, if that makes sense.
No, it's frustrating, and I think the topic that you use there as an example is one of several which you see go around the political spectrum time and time again. Sometimes that there is a political will, sometimes it's about, these are politicians with manifestos and thinking about the next election. Sometimes it feels, it's window dressing. But I think there's one thing there's a couple, I'd be interested in any others' reactions to the situation you described. And, you shouldn't give up, because policy making is an ongoing process. And whilst it might seem that something for one moment's in the media spotlight and then it's gone, doesn't mean it's necessarily disappeared completely from what's going on behind the scenes. And I think you just need to see it as if you're going to be specialising in this area, then you've got an opportunity to build and grow your contacts and your networks. And maybe some of the ideas that came from this group around inviting people. But going back to a point I made at earlier on, is that policymakers aren't a homogenous group. You've got to be very canny about how you engage and who to engage with. So sometimes, working with the government analytical community, so they speak your language. They work closely with policymakers, so that might be a useful way in, and build a kind of engagement strategy so that it's not just, because otherwise you will just, I can see why you've got frustrated, but you need to see it as part of the academic work that you're doing, that you need to build and grow a engagement strategy, starting just find somebody in the relevant department to be your first port of call, your go-to person, and have an initial conversation. Find out what the what's going on behind the scenes. Maybe there's something going on within Exeter, this centre, that you can invite somebody to. There's lots of different things that you can think about doing to just build their knowledge of you as eventually the go-to person on loneliness research.
Sure.
Yeah, if that helps. I don't know whether anyone's got any, because I don't want you to be too despondent. But if it's any, and this, I would say consummation, that's the wrong word, is that even though I work very closely to policymakers, a lot of the things that you've been saying are frustrations that we have as well, but you've got to keep working at it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's a good deal of fluctuation in terms of, people's priorities as well, which means that, 1 minute nobody's interested in loneliness. We had an announcement about it, and then unfortunately not a great deal more has happened. But it does show you how it can happen, that suddenly somebody gets it into their head, or the result of pressure from elsewhere, or somebody's spoken to somebody, suddenly people are interested. And the trick is really to ensure that policymakers and academics working together can actually push that a little bit further forward. And sometimes you have false starts. So the fact that it hasn't worked this year doesn't mean it's not going to work next year. And I think that's the trick. It's almost like being on standby. We were talking a bit about, a bit of foresight process will be helpful in terms of improving the engagement between academics and policymakers, because there's all these developments going on. We know they're in the pipeline. We're talking about select committees, the sitting, they're going to report in a year's time. What are the sort of things they're thinking about? What do manifestos say? What do ministerial agendas look like? You can begin to anticipate some of this stuff. And that improves the quality of the engagement.
And so I think that, as you nicely put there, a topic will come back into its own again. So keep working on it behind the scenes with people. So you're
of that, didn't you, about the topic coming up with the legal aid?
Yeah, that's right. So we did research on mediation, which was not as positive as the policymakers had hoped. But then when they withdrew legal aid from all private family law matters, and everybody had to go to mediation if they wanted legal aid, they suddenly realised that they could use our research to try and improve the way people saw mediation. And they actually came to us about how it could be done better. And
they remembered.
So and they had been on our advisory board, actually, somebody from both DWP and the Ministry of Justice who were charged with looking at.
I was saying to Anne over lunch, it's incredible the number of times that something comes into its own further on down the line. So you might have this brand new piece of research and then think, oh, well, what was the point of that? And then a couple of years later, and your name will be remembered.
That's one of the biggest. That's one of the biggest challenges, it seems to me. And it's having sat on the sort of other side of the desk, is that you're often confronted with questions, and you are desperate for an answer, and who can give you that answer? And if you've had previous engagement with people, it doesn't really matter how detailed developed it necessarily was, it's somebody you can talk to actually begin that process again. So I think that notion of contact between academics and policymakers is crucial if you're going to get past that first step.
That's what we were talking about, actually, about how there was sometimes some suspicion of a lone researcher and who was funding them, why were they doing it, but that if you can build up those personal relationships over time, it might, long term, it might be somewhere else.
And Rebecca's had her electronic hand up for a while.
Really, you were talking about kind of ringing somebody in the department and starting to make that contact, but how do you know who the right person is to make that contact with when they're obviously extremely busy people?
Well,
just that initial hurdle of where to find the right person, who to talk to, and how to.
Yeah, I know, and I'm laughing because one of the points I was going to say later is equally there's a policymaker doing the same thing. Who do I phone up? Who's the leading expert on X? So I think one of the things I was trying to get across today is there is an analytical community. So you only need to, so like today you've got to know me, I can help put people in. A lot of it's word of mouth. But one of the other things that I was going to come on to is that there are intermediaries. There are lots of think tanks. When you're doing your research, you'll be working with other stakeholders. So some of these think tanks are very good at corralling evidence and turning it into little policy briefing documents. They're skilled at that and getting evidence to policymakers. They're very good at convening little fora and inviting policymakers along. So I think you need to think about having several prongs of attack. And intermediaries is a really good one, but I don't think that needs to be, that shouldn't replace you as in your own right, having your own direct contacts with government. But it's one way in and to start building your knowledge of who the key people are. And no conversation about engagement can not talk about social media. Again, these intermediaries have their own sort of Twitter feeds. Start following some of those. Get your name known, and then eventually people will be following you, coming to you. So you'll be more expert than I am in the merits of Twitter and Facebook and stuff. But that is very, very powerful.
There are intermediaries, like the King's Fund, like
Health Foundation,
Institute, all those places. But actually, the Welcome Centre here,
exactly.
is a
absolutely.
brings together all sorts of different disciplines.
And the universities now.
So you'll have the voice of the university, and the voice of the centre, as well as you in your own right.
Absolutely.
Another thing, just linking it, actually to what you were saying about the loneliness, or there was, if you apply to government consultations, often your name sort of is kept on file, as it were. I understand it. So I know Zaina's, I don't know if she's still there, but she's working with the Law Commission, and her indication that she was doing a PhD on surrogacy at the moment, that they're going to review the surrogacy law here, and they're saying you need to reply to consultations, you need to sort of keep in touch with us. I mean, they are often, even if you are a lone researcher and a PhD student, they will often actually think, yes, this is right on the topic. So I'm guessing your loneliness research will be of enormous interest. And if you have thoughts about the strategy and what's wrong with it, why not get in touch with the architects of it or ask some questions about how they're implementing it. Is it working?
Same with the Law Commission, thank you, Anne. That is true, because when I was a PhD student, I responded to a government call for information about open research. And I kind of had to go through that imposter bit and go, oh, I am not worthy. But once I did, and I did it, that got me in contact with a lot of people that wanted to have that conversation. So you've got to kind of be a bit bold and go, hello.
They can only say no.
But they can only say no.
And you've got to start somewhere. So just got to work at it.
Yeah, parliamentary bodies as well, select committees are always asking for evidence, and the evidence is published, your name's listed, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. You can often say, the Welcome Centre at Exeter suggested I contact you, which sounds, perhaps much more grand than it actually is, me just saying, why don't you contact someone? But you can dress it up in a way that gives you more gravitas, if that's what you feel your problem is, than in other, and I think you do. I mean, I was terrified the first time I ever did this, but I think building those networks, even if they say no, they do remember your name, and sometimes they do come back to you.
And another thing that I've experienced is some of the eminent academics will go in direct to a minister. All that typically happens is that will then filter its way down to official level. Quite a canny way is, yes, by all means go in at the top, but make sure that underneath you've been working with the day-to-day officials, so when it does come down, that person will go, yes, I know so-and-so's research, and it's more likely to get an airing because you've been working at both levels. So that's quite a good tip.
We've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So, was there anything from this group here that you feel that you came up with that hasn't been spoken about?
Well, I think we picked up the intermediary point, didn't we? Was there anything else we?
I think it's okay. You don't have to make
I mentioned quite a lot of it, yeah.
Would you bring up the next slide, then, which is just my points, and I don't want to. So you've touched on most of the ones that I've pulled together here. I'm just going to have a quick flick through just to see if there were any specific points that we've not together covered. I think just going to the interest groups bit as a challenge is that sometimes they are very powerful, but the issue here is whether a topic is politically contestable or not. And I think you'll find that policymakers are a lot more open to challenging messages from academic research in areas where they haven't got strict manifesto commitments to stick to, but where things are really quite challenging, you might get more of a rebuttals. You just need to bear in mind just remind yourself of the environment and not see it as a personal affront against the credibility of your own research, because sometimes things are more politically acceptable than others. So just to give you, often there's a lot of controversy with the farming, and there's a very vociferous farming lobby. So that's sometimes why you find things don't always happen, because government doesn't want to upset farmers. The other thing is that ministers themselves, as the ultimate policy makers, whether they see themselves as such or not, is some are from a more academic background perhaps, and they can really mould the culture of a department. So you'll find some departments, and it can change over time depending on the leadership, are more open to engaging with academia than others. I think it's fair to say that the Department of Health and Social Care and also International Development Department are regarded as departments that are very open to research. And I think the fact that the model in the Department of Health and Social Care is through the NIHR means it's very much seen, it's independent. We keep it away from ministers deliberately so that we don't interfere in the production of evidence. So we've got quite a good and long-standing culture. Now the NIHR has been up and running for 12 years, but we've got ways, which I'll say something about as we finish, about how there's some ways of doing academic research in policy circles that responds to some of these challenges of speed and being more reactive. On the facilitators side, don't forget that there are manifestos, each department has what it calls a single departmental plan. If you're wanting to influence, some academics are less bothered about influencing policy making than others, but make sure you're abreast of what the relevant departments are doing. You can always anchor what you're doing, the ways of tailoring your outputs in language that you'll find reflected in the single departmental plans to make it resonate in that particular department. And as I was saying, develop your profile, develop your contacts, and just build the relationships, informal things, and one contact leads to another. And the final point I wanted to make on timing, this is a point that Chris Whitty makes, and you may have heard him say it before, is don't wait. if you're like 80% there with the production of your research, start getting it out there, because policy making will happen, it won't wait. So he says it's always better to share findings when they're 80% there than 100% there. It's risky, but it's also risky not having had that engagement and getting your research known and considered. So I know that might be controversial, but he does have a valid point there, I think. And linked to that is I don't think there's any best time or bad time to engage with government and the different types of policymakers or analysts. It's constant, as I was saying at the beginning, this cycle is messy. So just get stuck in, basically, because you'll never know. There's a lot of serendipity, as with so much in life, as to when something's going to chime. So, yeah, just go for it.
So can I just have a really quick
Of
question?
course.
And I think one of the things as academics, we sort of used to doing the detail and really trying to explore the complexity of the nature of the issue. And my sense is that that's less appealing to you know, and actually for most things, even though we know there isn't a magic bullet, we're still looking. We're still looking for it. So I think that's another.
Could you bring up the next slide? And you may be familiar with this inverted pyramid, but we get told this ourselves in government when we're communicating with policy and ministers. You have to think about the journalistic approach to communicating the evidence, and so it's about. I remember when I first joined the civil service. It's like if you have to think that you're going to be put in front of a minister, and you've got 2 minutes, and you've got to be able to say 3 things. What are the 3 important things about your piece of research? And if you can't do that, forget it. Which is quite brutal and bold, but that's what you've got to think like. So what we're finding and what we're saying when we're working on contracts in policy health research is about a range of outputs. So we very much encourage the academic peer-reviewed journals, and they come into their own in policy making. Think about tobacco policy and how that's been through judicial review. If it hadn't been for the body of scientific, rigorous, published evidence, we would not have ended up winning some of those legal cases.
But it took 50 years, didn't it? Because there are cases where they say exactly.
My point being is it's not to the expense of not having that type of output, but you also need to be thinking about. Have you heard of like the 1-3-25 model to report writing? So your main report's 25 pages. You then have a 3-page sort of long summary, and then a 1-page standalone summary. That's often you might find being asked to do. And also different ways of presenting information, making them eye-catching. But certainly policymakers don't care how many focus groups or how many online interviews you did. Whilst that's passionate to you, and whilst that's how you've generated what they really don't give 2 hoots. You need to anticipate that they might ask you at the end, so have it up your sleeve, but that information, they just want to know what works, what doesn't work, what do I do about it, and can I use it? That's the sorts of things that policy makers want to know. So I think we're just
last slide.
No, not quite. The bit on the left I've lifted is in a publicly available journal, Nature. You may have come across it.
I can let you have that.
And yes, because
no, I've got a subscription to Nature, so I can get hold of the article.
And well, actually, Louise Wood gave you a link to this one, because it has several authors, including Chris Whitty and Chris Wormold, and they are making a case for the importance of evidence synthesis, and they think that this is something that needs to grow in importance, and actually there needs to be an incentive, and they talk a little bit in the article about supply and demand, that if academics know that synthesising information is going to be useful to policymakers, then they'll do it. And if policymakers know that there will be places they can go to just to extract what the latest body of evidence says, then they'll use it. So, but it isn't going to happen unless government incentivises it and has the structures and cultures to encourage policymakers to be grabbing onto academic synthesis. And also if things perhaps like the REF, there's another REF coming up in 2021, whether there can be something to build on the impact that they've already worked on, whether there's something more that can be done about that. And so they're arguing that this is one of the critical types of research that can help influence policy making, and rapid synthesis in particular really does sing to the world of policy making. The NIHR has tried its best. It's got things like NIHR signals, NIHR highlights, NIHR theme reviews. So if you just Google those, and you'll get a sense of the types of outputs that we're trying to just get key messages across. So I'm going to leave you with a cartoon which sums up the world you find yourself and I find myself in.
Sorry, I'll go full size.
So I thought that was quite neat. There was the previous slide was just some examples which you'll find in that report that I mentioned of some of the things that exist now as good practice, like advisory groups and policy reviews where academia and policy making have worked together. Government's got more to do to build on those good examples, but one of them is what I work on, and I'm really proud of it, is called policy research units. And I've just completed commissioning 15 new academic-led consortia working on policy relevant topics across the whole business of the Department of Health and Social Care for the next 5 years, where we facilitate the funding of longer term programmes of research, but also some of the money is for reactive work. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. So give academics the freedom to identify what they think in given topics are where the department ought to be thinking, and we give breathing space to that. So that's where 80% of the funding, and 20% is for we'll phone up and go, do you know what, can you help us? And by tomorrow, we need to know what the latest evidence on X is. Can you help? But they're resourced to be able to do both. So, and we're encouraging other departments to think about that model, because we find it's quite successful. And Exeter is one of the universities that we obviously work with.
And now you know all those lovely people.
Can I just add? One thing that both journalists and I think policymakers to some extent do is exploit academics in that they ring you up, you give them your time, they take from you, and you don't get any offer of payment, you don't get any feedback on whether it's useful. And I mean, I think we could work better to get acknowledgement and evidence that our research has influenced policymakers, because sometimes they can be quite equivocal about whether they've used it. I mean, like the Ministry of Justice got a draft web page which word for word looks at our research. I asked them for a letter confirming it influenced them. They said, oh, well, it was one of the things that influenced us. And you think, that is word for it. You've got my headings.
Why they don't want to recognise that? Because I wouldn't have thought it would.
Well, because I don't know whether they go to their ministers and say, "Well, look, I've come up with these great ideas." I don't know, but I do think there ought to be some reciprocation, or at least acknowledgement.
Because on one level, that's great that they've actually used.
So I'm using it, saying this is my impact case study type. But I was a bit shocked they wouldn't even say, oh yes, you know.
Yeah.
Sadly, each department is a law unto itself.
Exactly,
And I think, you know, what Jane was saying was that DH is actually better than most, because DH would be desperately keen to acknowledge that. And actually that would add to our DH's credentials. Look, you know, this isn't just out of our heads. It's out of Exeter and other places, you know, and that's what we put first almost. That's why we use people like Michael Marmot and the rest of them, because, you know, that actually gives us added status.
Well, I think it's because it's on public-facing websites, and you know, ordinary people are supposed to go to it, and if they think it's a whole load of academics, you know, it will undermine its credibility or something. I don't know, but I don't know. It's quite, but I just think it is an issue. It's more, journalists are more exploitative, I would say.
Yeah,
but I do think it's a bit of an issue in that they sort of, like you say, you get rung up. Can you get this to us by the next day?
I'm sorry you've had that experience, because actually it adds strength to policy making. You can cite external academic.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were other people. I wouldn't say it just had to be me.
But we're sure it was.
I don't know. The headings were mine.
It won't happen again, will it? You start worrying.
I realise as always, we've gone a bit over time, but I think, first of all, next month's workshop, I'll be sending out an invitation soon, but that's what we're going to be. Luckily, we've been able to reschedule the ethics workshop that had to be cancelled in December.
Oh, good.
So that would be great.